The morning sun always rises slowly over the eastern ridge of Willow Creek Ranch. I have watched this same sunrise for nearly 30 years, since I was a boy helping my father with morning chores. Back then, the land stretched uninterrupted for miles in every direction. No subdivisions, no strip malls, just open country where generations of my family raised cattle and built a reputation for quality livestock that buyers recognized across 3 states. I inherited this ranch when my father passed 15 years ago. The property was struggling financially, weighed down by outdated equipment and breeding lines that had fallen behind industry standards. Most folks in town gave me 6 months before I would be forced to sell. But giving up was never an option for me. This land runs in my blood just as surely as it did in my father and his father before him. The first 5 years were the hardest. I worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the barn during calving season and skipping meals to save every possible dollar for reinvestment. Slowly, the ranch began to turn around. I focused on specialized breeding programs, leveraging genetics and careful selection to develop superior stock. That investment finally paid off when Thunderbolt was born. Even as a calf, Thunderbolt stood out from the herd. His conformation was perfect. His temperament balanced strength with docility. By his 3rd year, he had begun winning regional competitions and attracting attention from serious breeders across the country. At auction, his offspring commanded premium prices that transformed my financial situation. A single straw of his genetic material sold for enough to cover a month of ranch expenses. Thunderbolt was more than livestock. He represented 15 years of careful work and the future security of everything I had built. The ranch sits on 200 acres of what used to be entirely rural land. The eastern boundary runs along what was once Patterson family farmland, though they sold off their acreage 5 years ago. The developer moved quickly, clearing timber and breaking ground on what would become Meadowbrook, a state's 65 luxury homes with manicured lawns that ended just 100 yards from my property line. Most of the new residents kept to themselves. A few even seemed genuinely interested in ranch life, bringing their children to see the animals from across the fence. I did not mind them. Change is inevitable, and I have always believed there is room for different lifestyles to coexist peacefully. That philosophy was tested when the first strange vehicles began appearing along my boundary fence. They were expensive SUVs and pickup trucks that looked like they had never seen a day of actual work. The occupants would stand at the fence line, pointing toward my pastures and taking photos with long camera lenses. At first, I thought they might be interested in purchasing livestock, but they never approached the house or requested a proper visit. They just observed, made notes, and left. The encounters felt invasive, but I brushed aside my discomfort. I had fences to mend, cattle to tend, and a business to run. I could not afford to waste energy on minor irritations. Then the letters started arriving, formal complaints about everything from the appearance of my equipment shed to the natural smells of an active cattle operation. Each one bore the newly created logo of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I remember standing at my kitchen window one evening, watching the lights come on in those new houses one by one. The subdivision glowed with artificial brightness that dimmed the stars I had grown up beneath. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as I realized the boundary between our worlds was becoming more than just a physical fence line. Something was approaching that I did not yet understand, something that would test not just my patience, but my very right to exist as I always had. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association formed 6 months after the final home was sold. The developer had included mandatory HOA membership in every purchase contract, ensuring the organization would have authority over all property owners from day one. What most new residents did not anticipate was how quickly that authority would expand under the leadership of Eleanor Winters. Eleanor moved from Chicago with her husband, a semi-retired investment banker who spent most weekends traveling to golf courses around the country. She arrived with designer luggage and a vision for transforming Meadowbrook Estates into what she repeatedly called an exclusive community of distinction. Within weeks of settling into her corner lot home, Eleanor had volunteered for the HOA formation committee. By the time elections were held, she had positioned herself as the only serious candidate for board president. I first saw Eleanor at the local hardware store. She stood in the gardening section, designer handbag hanging from her wrist as she inspected a display of ornamental plants. Everything about her seemed calculated, from her perfectly highlighted blonde hair to her manicured fingernails painted the exact shade of her blouse. When the store owner greeted her as a new neighbor, her smile never reached her eyes. She spoke about her plans to elevate the community standards, explaining how proper regulations could ensure everyone maintained appropriate property values. The first official communication I received from the HOA was a letter claiming my fence line violated community sight lines and created an aesthetic disruption to residents. The boundary had stood unchanged for 3 generations. I politely responded with copies of my property survey and a reminder that my agricultural operation predated their development by nearly a century. I assumed that would resolve the matter. 3 days later, a second letter arrived complaining about agricultural odors affecting their outdoor gatherings. Then came concerns about my tractor noise during community quiet hours. Each complaint was more absurd than the last, but always delivered on official letterhead signed by Eleanor Winters, HOA president. I attempted to maintain peaceful relations. I invited Eleanor to visit the ranch and discuss her concerns directly. She arrived 30 minutes late, refused my offer of coffee, and spent the entire visit looking around my home with thinly disguised disdain. When I explained the realities of agricultural operations, she interrupted me mid-sentence. "Mr. Mitchell, while your occupation might have been appropriate when this was all farmland, times have changed. Our residents have invested millions in creating a premium neighborhood. Your operation is simply incompatible with modern community standards." I explained that my family had worked this land for generations before Meadowbrook Estates existed. Her response chilled me. "Progress waits for no one, Mr. Mitchell. The future is happening whether you choose to join it or not." After that meeting, the complaints escalated. Eleanor organized a petition among subdivision residents claiming my ranch created a public nuisance. Most did not sign, but those who did were vocal and persistent. I later learned Eleanor had specifically recruited new residents who had never lived near agricultural land before, fueling their concerns with exaggerated claims about health risks and property devaluation. The confrontation came to a head at the County Planning Commission meeting. I attended to request a routine permit for building a new equipment shed. Eleanor arrived with 4 HOA board members and a stack of documents. When my permit request came up on the agenda, she approached the podium uninvited. "Members of the commission, before you approve any new development on this problem property, I urge you to consider the impact on our community." She unfolded a satellite map of the area, pointing to my ranch with a perfectly manicured finger. "This unsightly operation diminishes our property values and creates ongoing quality of life issues for 65 families. We request a full environmental review before any permits are granted." I sat 3 rows back, my work-worn hands clenched in my lap, as she spoke about my family legacy as if it were some kind of industrial waste site. The commission chairman, thankfully familiar with local agricultural operations, denied her request for intervention. But as Alina returned to her seat, the look she gave me made one thing perfectly clear. This was not a simple boundary dispute anymore. This was a battle between two completely different ways of life, and she intended to win at any cost. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday in early September. The heavy envelope bore the logo of Preston and Winters Legal Associates. I later discovered that Winters was not coincidental, but referred to Alina's brother-in-law's firm. Inside, formal legal documents claimed a quarter-acre strip of my eastern pasture actually belonged to Meadowbrook Estates common area based on an obscure survey from 1973. The letter demanded I move my fence line back 30 feet within 14 days or face legal action. I immediately pulled out the metal storage box where my father kept all our property records. The original survey stakes from my grandfather's purchase in 1946 clearly marked boundaries that had remained undisputed for 75 years. Our family had maintained those fence lines, paid taxes on that acreage, and used the land continuously for 3 generations without a single question of ownership. The legal consultation cost me $4,000, nearly 2 months of operating profit and money I had specifically set aside for equipment repairs before winter. My attorney, a general practitioner from the county seat, reviewed the documents with growing concern. They are citing a survey commissioned during a potential highway expansion that never happened, he explained, pointing to the reference document. It was never officially adopted by the county, but technically it exists in the records. They are exploiting a gray area. He warned me this could evolve into years of litigation. Property disputes were notoriously complicated and expensive. Even if I eventually won, the legal fees could potentially bankrupt my operation before we ever reached a resolution. When I asked about simply ignoring their claim, his expression grew grave. They could file for an injunction that would prevent you from using the disputed land while the case proceeds. If they succeed with that motion, you would be legally barred from access to your own property for potentially years. That night, I walked the eastern fence line, measuring the 30-foot margin they claimed. The strip included prime grazing land and direct access to the creek that provided water for my livestock. Losing it would create significant operational problems beyond just the acreage itself. As I stood there in the gathering dusk, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the soft earth just outside my fence. Someone had been driving along the boundary very recently. October brought the start of hunting season and new complications. The first hunting weekend, I spotted unfamiliar pickup trucks parked along the county road near my eastern boundary. Men in orange vests with expensive rifles and spotting scopes walked confidently along what had always been my property line. When I approached one group, they produced hunting licenses for deer season, but claimed they were just scouting and not actually hunting yet. Something about their manner struck me as odd. They seemed too comfortable, too certain of their right to be there. The legal pressure continued mounting. Alina's attorney filed additional paperwork claiming historical easement rights across my property. Each filing required a response from my attorney, and each response drained more money from my increasingly strained finances. I began skipping meals to redirect every possible dollar toward legal defense, knowing I could not afford to lose this battle, but unsure how long I could sustain the fight. While checking fence lines one evening in late October, my headlights swept across something that made me slam on the brakes. Fresh survey stakes had been hammered into the ground well within what had always been my property, at least 60 feet past the 30 they initially claimed. Someone had spray-painted bright orange boundary markers on trees and rocks, creating a new line that cut deeply into my eastern pasture. These markings extended far beyond anything mentioned in their legal filings. I called my attorney immediately. He advised me to document everything but not to remove the stakes, as that could be used against me in court. So I spent the next morning photographing each unauthorized marker, my stomach knotting with a combination of rage and fear. The brazen nature of the encroachment suggested Alina had absolute confidence in her position or connections that made her believe the rules simply did not apply to her actions. That same afternoon, I encountered 3 men with surveying equipment standing fully 100 yards inside my property line. When I questioned their presence, the leader responded with practiced politeness. "We have permission from the Homeowners Association to access this common area. If you have concerns, you should contact Mrs. Winters." I showed them my property deed, pointing out they were standing on land that had been in my family for generations. Their response was to produce a letter on HOA letterhead authorizing their survey work on what was described as recently identified community property. They refused to leave until I threatened to call the sheriff, and even then departed with reluctant slowness, as if doing me a favor by respecting my wishes on my own land. That night, lying awake and staring at my bedroom ceiling, the true scope of what was happening finally crystallized in my mind. Alina was not simply making legal threats or filing paperwork. She was actively redrawing my ranch boundaries without waiting for court decisions. The tightness in my chest grew as I realized strangers with expensive rifles and questionable claims were now treating my private property as their hunting grounds. The boundary dispute had moved beyond paperwork to become a physical invasion, and the timing with hunting season seemed far from coincidental. As November deepened, the intrusions grew more frequent and bolder. I posted additional no trespassing signs along the disputed boundary, only to find them torn down or defaced within days. Each morning, I would find fresh vehicle tracks, food wrappers, and occasionally spent rifle cartridges just inside my fence line. The hunters were no longer merely scouting. They were actively entering my property, armed and apparently confident in their right to be there. I contacted the county sheriff, showing him the unauthorized boundary markers and evidence of trespassing. Sheriff Tanner had known my family for years, and his expression was sympathetic, but his response was not helpful. "Look, James, I understand your frustration, but this looks like a civil property dispute. Until the boundary question is legally settled, enforcement becomes tricky. My deputies cannot arrest someone who believes they have legitimate access rights." When I pointed out the torn down, no trespassing signs, he promised to increase patrols in the area, but advised me to work through proper legal channels. Those channels were already costing me thousands of dollars I could not afford to spend. The winter feed supply for my cattle would need to be purchased soon, and legal fees had already depleted my reserves. My attempts to reason with the HOA board proved equally futile. I attended their monthly meeting, requesting 5 minutes to address the boundary issue directly. Alina allowed me to speak, but positioned herself directly behind me at the podium, her presence an unspoken intimidation tactic. As I explained the historical boundaries and asked for cooperation in respecting property lines until legal resolution, residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some seemed genuinely concerned by my perspective. Others, clearly Alina's supporters, exchanged knowing smiles. When I finished speaking, Alina stepped forward, effectively dismissing me from the podium with a gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for sharing your perspective. Rest assured, the board is acting on proper legal guidance regarding community boundaries and access rights." She then proceeded to announce what she called an exciting new community amenity: Meadowbrook Estates would now offer exclusive hunting access to recently acquired open lands for residents and their guests. When I stood to object, pointing out she was referring to my property, two men I recognized as HOA security contractors approached and firmly suggested I leave the building. That weekend, the distant crack of rifles echoed closer than ever to my home. My horses grew skittish in their paddock, refusing to approach the eastern fence line. The cattle, normally spread across the pasture, clustered anxiously in the western section, as far from the disputed boundary as possible. Animals sense danger in ways humans often ignore, and their behavior spoke volumes about the changing atmosphere on the ranch. I spent Saturday patrolling my property line, confronting 3 separate groups of hunters who had crossed my fence. Each produced identical laminated permission cards signed by Eleanor Winters, granting them access to what was described as Meadowbrook Estates Wildlife Management Area. When I informed them they were trespassing on private property, their responses ranged from confused apology to open hostility. One man suggested I take it up with the HOA if I had concerns, but refused to leave until I began recording him with my phone camera. Sunday morning dawned with heavy fog clinging to the ground, obscuring visibility beyond 50 yards. I was in the barn preparing feed when my ranch hand Miguel came running, his face ashen. He had been checking fence lines and had discovered something at the eastern boundary. His voice shook as he tried to explain, but ultimately he just said, "You need to come now, boss." I followed Miguel across the pasture, the wet grass soaking through my jeans as we hurried toward the eastern fence line. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing a scene that would be forever burned into my memory. On the ground, partially obscured by tall grass, lay a massive dark form. Even from a distance, I recognized the distinctive white blaze on the forehead thunderbolt. My prize bull, 15 years of careful breeding and $140,000 of genetic perfection, lay motionless on his side. Blood had pooled beneath his powerful frame, now still and lifeless on the damp earth. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as I touched his cold hide. The bullet had struck him directly through the heart, a clean shot from what must have been a high-powered hunting rifle. Miguel stood silently beside me, his hat in his hands out of respect. When I finally found my voice, it emerged as a whisper. "When did this happen?" "Must have been overnight, boss. He was fine at evening check." As I circled Thunderbolt's massive body, rage and grief fighting for dominance in my chest, I noticed something that stopped me cold. A bright orange hunting tag had been affixed to his ear, the kind hunters used to claim deer or elk during legal hunting season. Someone had shot my prize breeding bull, and then had the audacity to tag him like a wild game trophy. I carefully removed the tag, turning it over in my shaking hands. On the back, signed in flowing handwriting I had come to recognize from countless HOA complaint letters, was a name. Eleanor Winters, with the title Authorized Game Management Officer, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. This was not an accident. This was not a case of mistaken identity or hunter confusion. This was a deliberate act of destruction aimed directly at my livelihood. As I knelt there in the blood-soaked grass beside the animal that represented my ranch's future, I understood the full scope of what I was facing. Eleanor Winters had just escalated our boundary dispute into outright warfare, and she had struck the first devastating blow. The veterinarian arrived within the hour. Dr. Sarah Reynolds had cared for my livestock for over a decade and had personally assisted with breeding programs that produced Thunderbolt. When she saw his massive form lying in the field, her professional composure briefly cracked. She knelt beside him, examining the wound with clinical precision that belied the sadness in her eyes. This was a high-velocity round James, likely a .3006 or similar hunting caliber. Death would have been almost instantaneous. She looked up at me. "Do you want me to extract the bullet? It might be evidence." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. While she worked, I photographed everything: the body position, the blood pattern, the hunting tag, the surrounding area showing the clear location well within my property line. Each click of the camera shutter felt like another piece of armor being forged from my grief. This was no longer about property lines or petty HOA disputes. This was destruction of livestock, trespassing, and illegal hunting, all criminal offenses. That afternoon, I drove to the county seat and filed a formal police report, providing the photographs and the bullet Dr. Reynolds had extracted. The officer took my statement but warned me that prosecuting the specific shooter might be difficult without direct witnesses. That evening, I called Wilson Barnes, an old school friend who now worked as a security consultant. By nightfall, he had installed 6 high-resolution trail cameras at strategic points along my eastern boundary. These would capture license plate numbers, faces, and timestamp all activity. I also purchased additional no trespassing signs, this time with bright orange backgrounds and explicit warnings about video surveillance and prosecution. Miguel and I worked late into the night setting concrete posts and installing heavyweight cattle panels to reinforce the boundary fence. As we worked, Miguel mentioned something that caught my attention. "You know, Mr. Mitchell, my cousin Jorge works for the landscaping company that maintains Meadowbrook Estates. He says Mrs. Winters has been holding private meetings with people who do not live in the subdivision. Men with expensive hunting gear coming and going from her house at odd hours." This information triggered something in my mind, a possible connection I had not considered. I asked Miguel if his cousin might be willing to share what he knew. Jorge agreed to meet me the following evening at a diner 20 miles away, where no one from Meadowbrook would recognize us. Jorge appeared nervous but determined as he slid into the booth across from me. He spoke quietly, occasionally glancing toward the door. "Mrs. Winters started something new about 2 months ago. The HOA began offering what they call exclusive hunting packages to non-residents. People pay $5,000 for weekend access to what she calls their private hunting preserve. The money supposedly goes toward community projects, but no one has seen any new improvements." He slid a folded paper across the table, a copy of an internal HOA newsletter that had not been publicly distributed. It advertised premium hunting opportunities, with guaranteed trophy potential, in the newly acquired Meadowbrook Wilderness Extension. The description matched exactly the location of my eastern pasture. Jorge lowered his voice further. "Last week, I was pruning shrubs near her house when I overheard her on the phone. She was telling someone they could guarantee a successful hunt because there was prize livestock that would make impressive trophies. I did not understand what she meant until Miguel told me about your bull." I thanked Jorge for his courage and drove home with the newsletter clutched in my hand, the first concrete evidence linking a leaner directly to what had happened to Thunderbolt. That night, I called my original attorney and explained the situation had escalated beyond a simple boundary dispute. He recommended Patricia Vasquez, a former prosecutor who now specialized in agricultural crime cases. Patricia arrived at my ranch the next morning dressed in a suit that somehow looked perfectly appropriate against the backdrop of my kitchen table covered with evidence folders. She listened without interruption as I laid out the entire situation: the boundary dispute, the escalating tensions, Thunderbolt's killing, and the information about HOA hunting packages. She examined each document methodically, making notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I showed her the HOA newsletter and hunting tag with Alina's signature, her expression hardened. "They have committed at least 7 separate violations of state law," she explained, pointing to highlighted statutes in a legal reference book she had brought. "This is criminal trespass, illegal hunting, destruction of agricultural property, and possibly racketeering given the profit scheme." She looked up at me, her eyes reflecting a determination that matched my own growing resolve. "What these people did to your bull was not just illegal, it was a calculated attack on your livelihood. But Alina Winters made a serious mistake. She got greedy. By turning this into a profit-making venture, she triggered much more serious criminal statutes than a simple boundary dispute. And that hunting tag with her signature, that is what we call documentary evidence of criminal intent. She actually signed her name to the crime." For the first time since finding Thunderbolt, I felt the weight on my chest lighten slightly. Patricia outlined a comprehensive strategy involving both criminal complaints and civil action against Alina personally, and the HOA as an organization. The path forward had emerged from my darkest moment. Alina had overplayed her hand and left a trail of evidence that would become her undoing. As Patricia left, promising to file initial paperwork immediately, she paused at the door. "Document everything from this point forward, every encounter, every trespasser, every communication. This is not just about getting justice for what happened, it is about making sure it never happens again." I nodded, a sense of purpose replacing the helpless anger that had consumed me since finding Thunderbolt. Alina had declared war on my way of life, but she had no idea what kind of fight she had started. My dining room transformed into command central over the next 2 weeks. The walls became covered with maps, property surveys, and timelines. Each day brought new evidence strengthening our position. Property surveys dating to 1943 definitively proved my boundary claims, with original markers still visible in exactly the locations my grandfather had documented. State wildlife officials confirmed hunting licenses had been improperly issued based on misrepresented property access. Tax records showed my agricultural exemption covering the disputed land for decades without challenge. Patricia filed complaints with 3 separate agencies: the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Trespassing and Livestock Destruction, the State Wildlife Commission for hunting violations, and the County Recorder regarding fraudulent property claims. Meanwhile, I worked different angles within the community itself. Not everyone in Meadowbrook Estates supported Alina's tactics. Many residents had purchased homes there specifically to enjoy the rural setting and had no interest in antagonizing neighboring properties. Martin Chen, a retired professor who lived at the edge of the subdivision, became an unexpected ally after I shared the full story with him. "Several of us have been uncomfortable with how the HOA is being run," he confided during a meeting at my kitchen table. "The aggressive stance against your ranch, the escalating fees, the lack of financial transparency, it all feels wrong. But Alina has cultivated a core group of supporters who automatically vote with her on every issue." Martin organized a coalition of sympathetic Meadowbrook residents challenging HOA leadership. They began requesting financial records regarding the hunting packages and questioned the legality of claiming access rights to disputed property. This internal pressure created exactly the distraction we needed while building our legal case. Local ranchers, concerned that a precedent might threaten their own operations, provided statements about historical boundaries and agricultural practices. The County Agricultural Extension Office supplied documentation of my ranch's continuous operation and compliance with all regulations. The newspaper's agricultural reporter, began investigating Alina's hunting scheme after Patricia strategically mentioned certain aspects during a casual conversation about livestock protection laws. Most crucially, we coordinated with state game wardens to monitor the property during the final weekend of hunting season. Based on the pattern established in previous weeks, we anticipated Alina would bring another hunting group onto my property. Trail cameras were positioned strategically. 3 neighboring ranchers volunteered as witnesses, stationing themselves at key observation points with binoculars and video equipment. When Saturday arrived, we did not have to wait long. At precisely 5:45 a.m., 4 vehicles turned onto the access road bordering my eastern fence line. Through binoculars, I watched Alina personally greet the occupants. 4 men carrying expensive rifle cases who passed her what appeared to be envelopes. She consulted her clipboard, handed each person what looked like the now familiar permission slips, and then led them directly toward my property, pointing toward the western pasture where my remaining livestock grazed. Game wardens hidden in the tree line watched as the group crossed my fence line, moving well onto my property with rifles now removed from cases. The wardens waited until the hunters had clearly committed to trespassing before emerging from concealment. The scene unfolded exactly as planned. Officers identified themselves, collected weapons and identification, and began formal questioning about hunting permissions. I approached with Patricia at my side and a video camera documenting everything. Alina stood frozen near my fence line, her designer hunting jacket looking absurdly out of place against the working ranch backdrop. Her confident smile faltered as she saw me walking toward her, replaced by an expression I had never seen on her carefully composed face: fear. "Mrs. Winters," Patricia said, her tone professionally neutral despite the circumstances. "I represent Mr. Mitchell in both criminal and civil matters regarding your unauthorized access to his property and the destruction of his livestock. These officers have questions about your role in organizing illegal hunting activities." Alina attempted to recover her composure, straightening her posture. "This is HOA common area according to our community survey. We have every right to be here." Patricia smiled thinly. "We have documented evidence that you knowingly misrepresented property boundaries to sell hunting access on land you do not own. We have witnesses, documentation of payments, and your signature on illegal hunting tags. Would you like to continue this conversation here, or would you prefer to schedule a formal deposition with your attorney present?" The hunters, now realizing they had been misled, began demanding refunds and threatening their own legal action against the HOA. One man, apparently an attorney himself, distanced himself from Alina and began cooperatively providing his complete statement to the game wardens. As officers collected final statements and evidence, I stood silently watching Alina's carefully constructed facade crumble completely. Every calculated move in her months-long campaign had been meticulously documented, and now formed the foundation of multiple legal actions against her personally, and the HOA she controlled. The organization she had weaponized against me would now become the vehicle of her downfall. The legal proceedings lasted 18 months. The system moves slowly, but in this case, it moved with absolute certainty toward justice. Alina faced criminal charges for conspiracy, criminal trespass, agricultural property damage, and wildlife management violations. Each charge was supported by overwhelming evidence, from the hunting tag bearing her signature to video footage of her escorting hunters onto my property. The HOA insurance company, after reviewing the documentation Patricia assembled, made the business decision to settle my civil claim rather than risk trial. The settlement included financial compensation exceeding Thunderbolt's market value, covering not just the animal himself, but the projected value of his future offspring and genetic material. More importantly, it included a permanent easement agreement that legally protected my property boundaries from any future disputes. The hunters received substantial fines and suspension of hunting privileges for 5 years. Most claimed they had been deceived about property ownership and cooperated fully with investigators, providing additional evidence against Alina in exchange for reduced penalties. Perhaps most satisfying was watching Alina removed from the HOA board by overwhelming vote, once residents discovered how their dues had funded her legal defense. The financial records Martin Chen and his coalition demanded revealed that Alina had diverted over $75,000 of HOA funds to her brother-in-law's law firm, without proper board approval, a violation of their own bylaws that triggered a separate investigation. My eastern boundary now stands clearly marked with heavy steel posts and permanent survey markers, protected by a conservation easement that prevents any future disputes. The fence line has been reinforced and modernized, with security cameras monitoring key access points. Signs clearly indicating private property and agricultural operations are posted every 50 feet, a visual reminder of hard lessons learned. While no amount of money could truly replace Thunderbolt, his legacy continues through offspring now maturing in my herd. His genetic line will influence my ranch for generations to come. More importantly, the settlement funds allowed me to expand my operation, purchasing adjacent land to the north that secures water rights and grazing capacity well into the future. The Meadowbrook HOA, under entirely new leadership, adopted revised bylaws requiring agricultural education for all board members and established respectful protocols for interacting with neighboring properties. Martin Chen, now serving as board president, has become a valued friend and advocate for cooperative rural-suburban relationships. On the 1-year anniversary of finding Thunderbolt, neighbors from both the subdivision and surrounding ranches gathered at the spot where he fell. Together, we planted an oak tree that will stand for generations, a living monument not just to what was lost, but to the understanding that emerged from conflict. Children from Meadowbrook estates now visit the ranch regularly for educational programs about agricultural life, learning respect for the land and the animals that sustain our community. Alina moved away shortly after the final court proceedings concluded. Her husband sold their home at a substantial loss, and they relocated to a gated community in another state. Her ambitions of neighborhood dominance were thoroughly defeated, leaving behind cautionary tales that residents still occasionally share at community gatherings. My ranch continues as it has for generations, though I carry a hard-earned wisdom about protecting what matters. The land remains my family's legacy, now more secure than ever before. When I walk the eastern fence line now, I see not just the boundary between properties, but a clear understanding that different ways of life can coexist when based on mutual respect rather than power and control. Sometimes in the early morning, when mist hangs low over the pastures and the world feels momentarily suspended between night and day, I imagine I can see Thunderbolt's powerful silhouette moving among the herd. In those moments, I remember that some things worth fighting for cannot be measured in acres or dollars, but in the right to preserve a way of life that connects us to the land and to each other across generations. The boundary that once divided us now serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes slow, eventually finds its way home, just as surely as cattle return to the barn at day's end, following paths worn deep by those who came before.